A natural girl. In the spring of her sophomore year, when she was 20, Susan Andrews told her father very calmly that she didn't love him anymore. She regretted it, or at least the tone of it, almost at once, but it was too late. He sat looking stunned for a few seconds and began to cry, all hunched over to hide his face from her, trying with one unsteady hand to get a handkerchief out of his dark suit. He was one of the 5 or 6 most respected hematologists in the United States, and nothing like this had happened to him for a great many years. They were alone in Susan's dormitory room at a small celebrated liberal arts college called Turnbull in Wisconsin. She had worn a demure yellow dress that day because it seemed appropriate for his visit, but now she felt constricted by the primness of it and the way it obliged her to keep her narrow, pretty knees pressed together. She would much rather have been wearing faded jeans and a man's shirt with the top 2 buttons unfastened as she did on most other days. Her brown eyes were big and sorrowful, and her long hair was almost black. She had recently been told many times, in ardor and with justice, that she was a lovely girl. She knew that if she'd made her declaration in anger or in tears, there might now be some way to take it back, but she wasn't really sorry to have that option closed. She had come to learn the value and the price of honesty in all things. If you dealt cleanly with the world, there was never any taking of anything back. Still, this was the first time she had ever seen her father cry, and it brought a heaviness of blood to her own throat. "All right," Dr. Andrews said in a broken voice, still hanging his head. "All right, you don't love me. But tell me this much, dear. Tell me why." "There is no why," Susan said, grateful that her voice came out in a normal way. "There's no more why to not loving than there is to loving. I think most intelligent people understand that." And he got slowly to his feet, looking 10 years older than he'd looked a few minutes before. He had gone to get home to St. Louis, and the drive would be an agony of distance. "Well," he said, "I'm sorry I cried. Guess I'm turning into some kind of maudlin old man or something. Anyway, I'd better be getting started. I'm sorry. I'm sorry about everything. I wish you wouldn't apologize. I'm sorry too. Wait, I'll walk you out to the car." And all the way back to the sun-dazzled parking lot, past very old, neat college buildings and clusters of boisterously laughing kids. Had anybody ever dreamed there would be this many kids in the world? Edward Andrews tried to plan his parting words. He didn't want to say he was sorry again, but couldn't think of anything else. At last he said, "I know your mother'd like to hear from you, Susan, and so would your sisters. Why don't you call home tonight if you're not too busy?" "Okay, sure," she said. "I'm glad you reminded me." "Well, drive carefully." Then she was gone, and he was on the road. Edward Andrews had 7 daughters, and he liked being known as a family man. It often pleased him to consider that all his girls were nice-looking, and most of them smart. The oldest was long married to a deep-thinking professor of philosophy who might have been intimidating if he hadn't continued over the years to be a shy and vulnerable boy. The second was rarely seen because her husband was an admirably steady lawyer in Baltimore who didn't like to travel. And the third was in evidence perhaps a little too much. A sweetly dopey girl, knocked up in high school and quickly married to a nice bumbling kid for whom jobs had frequently to be found. And there were the 3 little girls still living at home, all of them solemn about hairstyling and menstrual cycles, and all exasperating joy to have around the house. But there was only one Susan. She was the middle one, the middle child, born soon after he'd come back from the war, and he would always associate her birth with the first high hopes of world peace. Framed photographs on the walls at home showed her kneeling as a 6-year-old Christmas angel with gauze and wire wings, or seated with far more decorum than anyone else at a birthday party table. And he couldn't even flip through the family snapshot albums without having his heart stopped every time by those big, sorrowful eyes. "I know who I am," she seemed to be saying in each picture. "Do you know who you are?" I don't like Alice in Wonderland, she had told him once when she was 8. You don't? Why? Because it's like a fever dream. And he had never again been able to read a page of either of those books, or to look at the famous Tenniel illustrations without seeing what she meant and agreeing with her. Making Susan laugh had never been easy unless you had something really funny to say, but it was always well worth the effort if you did. He could remember staying late in the office when she was 10 or 12, or hell, right on top through her high school years for that matter, in order to sort out all the funny things that had come into his head and to save only one, the best, for trying out on Susan when he got home. Oh, she had been a marvelous child. And although it had seemed to surprise her, it was no surprise at all to him when she was accepted into one of the finest colleges in the country. They knew an exceptional person when they found one. But how could anyone have guessed she would fall in love with her history teacher, a divorced man of twice her age, and that she would then insist on going with the man to his new job at a state university, even though it meant forfeiting the Turnbull tuition that had been paid in full? Dear, look, he had said in the dormitory this afternoon, trying to reason with her. I want you to understand this. It isn't the money. That's not important, apart from its being a little on the irresponsible side. The point is simply that your mother and I feel you're not old enough to make a decision like this. Why bring mother into it, she said. Why do you always need mother to support whatever it is you want? I don't, he said. I'm not doing that. But we're both deeply concerned, or I'll put it this way, if you like, I'm deeply concerned. Why? Because I love you. Do you love me? And so he had walked right into it, like a comedian walking into a thrown custard pie. He knew she might not really have meant it, even if she thought she did. Girls of that age were so busy being overwhelmed by romance and sex that they didn't even know what they were saying half the time. Still, there it was, the last thing he had ever expected to hear from his favorite child. And he was ready to crumple up and cry all over again as he held the car down to the speed limit on the interstate. But he fought back the tears because he had to keep his eyes clear, and because his wife and the younger girls were waiting at home, and because everything else that made sense in his life would be waiting there too. And besides, no civilized man would go to pieces twice in the same day. As soon as she was alone, Susan hurried to David Clark's apartment and into his arms, where she cried for a long time, surprising herself because she hadn't meant to cry at all. Oh, baby, he said, stroking her shuddering back. Oh, now, baby, it can't have been all that bad. Come and have a drink and we'll talk it over. David Clark was neither strong nor handsome, but the bewildered look that had blighted his boyhood was long submerged now in his face, that suggested intelligence and humor. For years he had made it a point of honor not to mess around with the girls in the classes he taught. There isn't any sport in it, he would explain to other teachers. It's taking unfair advantage. It's shooting fish in a barrel. It was shyness, too, and a terrible fear of rejection, though he didn't usually mention those aspects of the matter. But the whole of that argument had vanished some months ago when he found he could get through a lecture only by letting his gaze go back time and again, like that of a man seeking nourishment, to Miss Andrews in the front row. Oh, Jesus Christ almighty, he told her during their first night together. Oh, baby, you're like nothing else I've ever known. You're like, oh, Jesus, God, you're extraordinary. She told him in whispers that he had opened a whole new world for her. She told him he had brought her to life. Within a very few days, she moved in with him, leaving only enough of her belongings in the dormitory room to make it presentable, and so began the happiest time in David Clark's memory. There was never an awkward or a disappointing moment. He couldn't stop marveling at how young she was, because she was never silly and often wise. He loved to watch her walk around his place, naked or dressed, because the look on her sweet gray face made clear that she felt at home. Oh, don't go away. That was the cry, or the plea, that had broken from David Clark's mouth, as if wholly beyond his control with almost all the women he'd known since his divorce. Several girls had seemed to find it endearing, others had been baffled by it, and one sharp-tongued woman had called it an unmanly thing to say. But after the first few nights with Susan, he rarely fell back on that line. This magnificently young, long legged girl whose flesh held the very pulse and rhythm of love was here to stay. Hey, Susan, he said once. Know what? What? You make me feel calm. That may not sound like a very big deal, but the point is, I've wanted to be calm all my life, and nobody else has ever made me feel that way. Well, that's certainly a nice compliment, David, she said, but I think I can top it. How? You make me feel like I know who I am. On the afternoon of her father's visit, when she tried to explain how she'd felt on seeing her father cry, David did his best to soothe and comfort her. But before the but before long, she withdrew from him to grieve in solitude in another room, and the silence went on a little too long for his liking. Look, he told her, why don't you write him a letter? Take 3 or 4 days over it if you want to make it nice. Then you'll be able to put the whole thing behind you. That's what people do, haven't you noticed? People learn to put things behind them. They were married a year and a half later, in a Presbyterian church near the vast university campus where David was then employed. They had a spacious old apartment that visitors frequently found interesting, and for a while they felt little need of anything to do except take pleasure in each other. But soon David began to worry long and hard about the outrage of the war in Vietnam. He lectured angrily about it in the classroom. He helped to circulate petitions and to organize campus rallies. And he got quietly drunk over it a few times, alone, stumbling to bed at 2 or 3 in the morning and muttering incomprehensibly until he passed out in the warmth of Susan's sleep. You know something? He asked her one evening in the kitchen, when he was helping her wash the dishes. I think Eugene McCarthy is going to emerge as the greatest political hero of the second half of this century. He makes the Kennedy brothers look sick. And later that night, he began to complain that he'd never liked academic life in the first place. Teachers simply aren't plugged into the world, he told her as he walked dramatically around the living room with a drink in his hand. She was curled up on the sofa with her sewing basket, mending a torn seam in a pair of his pants. Christ's sake, he said. We read about the world and we talk about it, but we're never a part of it. We're locked safe away somewhere else, off on the sidelines or up in the clouds. We don't act. We don't even know how to act. It's always seemed to me that you do, Susan said. You apply professional skills to sharing your knowledge with others, and so you help to broaden and enrich people's minds. Isn't that acting? I don't know, he said, and he was almost ready to pull back from the whole discussion. Disparaging his work might only undermine the very foundation of her respect for him. And this was an even more chilling thought. There might have been a hint when she'd said, "Isn't that acting?" that she meant acting in the theatrical sense, as if all those lectures back at Turnbull, when he'd paced the head of the classroom to the music of his own voice, pausing again and again to turn and look at her, as if all that had been nothing more than what an actor is expected to do. He sat quietly for a while, until it occurred to him that this too might be considered an act. A man with a drink in the lamplight, brooding. Then he was on his feet and in motion again. Okay, he said, but look, I'm 43. In 10 more years, I'll be wearing carpet slippers. I'll be watching the Merv Griffin show and getting peevish from wishing you'd hurry up with the popcorn. Do you see what I'm trying to say? And the point is, this whole McCarthy thing is enormously attractive to me. I'd really like to be mixed up in something like that. If not with McCarthy himself, then at least with somebody who's on our side. Somebody who knows the world's going to fall apart unless we can make people up and help them to see their, oh shit, baby, I want to get into politics. Many carefully worded letters went out over the next few weeks and many nervous phone calls. Old acquaintances were revived, some of them leading to new acquaintances. There were interviews and lunches in various cities with men who could either help him or not, and who often kept their secret until the moment of the parting handshake. In the end, when it was too late to do any useful work for the McCarthy campaign anyway, David was hired to write speeches for a handsome, vigorous Democrat named Frank Brady, who was then running for governor of a heavily industrial Midwestern state and had been acclaimed in several national magazines for his charisma. And when Frank Brady won the election, David was retained in the state house as a member of the governor's inner circle. Oh, it isn't just writing speeches, he explained to his wife when they were settled with their belongings in the drab suburban metropolis of the state's capital city. The speeches are only the gravy. A lot more of my time is spent in things like, well, like getting up position papers and keeping them fresh. What are position papers? Susan asked. Well, Frank has to be ready with well reasoned opinions on all the issues. Issues like Vietnam and civil rights, of course, but a lot of other stuff too. Farm prices, labor management relations, the environment, and all of that. So I do some research. Oh, and there's a really good staff of research people in the office to make it easy for me. And I put together 4 or 5 typewritten pages, something Frank can read and digest in a few minutes, and that's his position paper. It becomes the position he'll take on whatever issue it is, whenever it's being discussed. Oh, Susan said. While listening to him talk, she had decided that their sofa and coffee table didn't look right where they were against the far wall of this unfamiliar, oddly proportioned room. By moving them over here, and by putting these chairs over there, it might be possible to restore the pleasing order of their old, interesting place. But she didn't have much hope for her plan. The new arrangement probably wouldn't look right either. Well, she said, I see. Or at least I think I see. It means that apart from writing every word that comes out of the man's mouth, except, of course, for the television talk shows, when all he does is mumble and grin at movie stars. Apart from that, you do his thinking for him too, right? Oh, now come on, he said, and he gestured widely, to show how foolish and how wrong she was. He wished they weren't in chairs, because if they'd been on the sofa, he would have taken her in his arms. Baby, come on, look. Frank Brady is a man who out of nowhere, who made his own way without owing anybody anything, who then waged a strong and inspiring campaign, and who's been freely elected governor. Millions of people trust him and believe in him and look to him for leadership. On the other hand, all I am is an employee, one of his aides, or what I guess is called a special counsel. Is it really so terrible that I feed him words? I don't know. I guess not. And I mean, that's good. That's fine. Everything you've said, only listen. I'm really tired out. Could we sort of go to bed now? When she became pregnant, Susan was pleased to discover that she liked it. She had heard any number of women talk of pregnancy as a slow ordeal to be endured, but now from month to month she felt only a peaceful ripening. Her appetite was good, she slept well, she was hardly ever nervous, and toward the end she was willing to acknowledge that she enjoyed the deference of strangers in public places. I almost wish this could go on forever, she said to David. It does slow you down a little, but it really makes your body feel good. Good, he said. I knew it would. You're a natural girl. Everything you do is so natural. I think that's why I've always liked I think that's what I've always liked best about you. Their daughter, who they named Candace, caused substantial changes in their lives. They had suddenly relinquished their privacy. They were jittery all day. Everything looked fragile and smelled sour. But they both knew better than to complain. And so, by finding ways to encourage and console each other, they got through the early, most difficult months without making any mistakes. Several times a year, David traveled to a distant eastern town to visit the children of his first marriage, and those were never happy occasions. The boy was 16 now and failing all his courses in high school, failing too, it seemed, in all attempts at making friends. He was mostly silent and evasive around the house, cringing away from his mother's tactful suggestions about professional counseling and getting help, rousing himself only to laugh at the silliest jokes on television. It seemed clear that he would soon leave home to join the floating world of hippies, where brains didn't count for much and friendship was held to be as universal as love. The girl was 12 and much more promising, though her sweet face was blotched with bad skin and seemed set forever in a melancholy look, as if she couldn't stop contemplating the nature of loss. And their mother, once a girl on whom David Clark had believed his very life depended, but it's true, I mean it, I can't live without you, Leslie, had become a harried, absent-minded, stout, and pathetically pleasant creature of middle age. He always felt he had blundered into a house of strangers. Who are these people? He kept asking himself, looking around. Are these people supposed to have something to do with me? Or I with them? Who's this wretched boy, and what's the matter with this sad little girl? Who's this clumsy woman, and why doesn't she do something about her clothes and her hair? When he smiled at them, he could feel the small muscles around his mouth and his eyes performing the courteous ritual of each smile. When he had dinner with them, he might as well have been eating in some old and honorable cafeteria where tables were shared for convenience, but where all the customers, hunched over their plates, respected one another's need to be alone. Well, I wouldn't be alarmed about it, David, his former wife said once, when he'd taken her aside to discuss their son. It's an ongoing problem, and we'll simply have to deal with it on those terms. Toward the end of that visit, he began counting the hours. 3 hours. 2 hours. Oh, Jesus, one more hour. Until finally, gulping fresh air on the street, he was free. All the way back on the plane that night, riding over half of America, as he munched dry roasted peanuts and drank bourbon, he did his best to empty his mind of everything and to keep it that way. And at last, trembling with fatigue at 3 in the morning, he carried his suitcase up the steps of his own house and into the living room, where he felt along the wall for the light switch. He meant to tiptoe quickly through the rooms and go to bed, but found instead that he had to stand a long time in the brightness, looking around, stunned by a sense of having never seen this place before. Who lived here? And he started down the shadowed hall to find out. The door of the baby's room was only partly open and there wasn't much light, but he could see the tall white crib. And between the slender bars of it, deep in the scents of talcum powder and sweet piss, he could see a lump that occupied hardly any space but seemed to give off energy in its very stillness. Someone alive was in there. Someone was in there who would grow up soon and who might turn out to be anybody at all. He hurried to the other dark bedroom where he allowed himself just enough light from the hall for guidance. "David?" Susan said, half asleep, turning heavily in the bedclothes. "Oh, I'm so glad you're home." "Yeah," he told her. "Oh, Jesus, baby, so am I." And in her arms he discovered that his life wasn't over yet, after all. Susan found little to like in the capital city. It went on for miles, everywhere you looked, without ever really becoming a city at all. There were many trees, that was nice, but the rest of it seemed to be all shopping malls and gas stations and gleaming fast food franchises. When the baby was old enough to ride in a stroller, she hoped she might explore new parts of town and find better things. But that turned out to be as futile as wishing David hadn't gone to work for Frank Brady in the first place. One warm afternoon, having ventured too far from home for comfort, she was on her way back, pushing the stroller when it began to seem that she might not make it. There were only about 3 blocks to go, but in the shimmering haze of the day, they looked like 5 or 6 more. She stopped to rest, breathing hard, and became very much aware of her heart. The approximate size and shape and weight of it, the feel of it, as well as its beating and its terrible mortality. The baby turned in the plastic seat to look up and to ask with round eyes why they had stopped, and Susan did her best to answer that look with a reassuring smile. "We're okay, Candace," she said, as if Candace could understand. "We're okay. We'll be home in just a minute." And she made the distance. She even made the stairs, which were the worst part. She got Candace bedded down, got the contraption of the stroller folded flat and put away. Then she lay on the living room sofa until her heart came back to normal, until the big thumping threat of it receded and was absorbed once again into the body that had been made to feel so good in pregnancy. She was still on the sofa wondering whether or not to take a nap when David came home from work. "Wow," he said, sinking into one of the chairs across the room from her. "Jesus. Talk about a hard day at the office. I want to tell you, baby, this one was a bitch." As she listened, or rather as she tried to listen while watching him talk, it occurred to Susan that he looked older than his age. He had taken to wearing a short beard at her suggestion. It was she who trimmed it for him every 3 weeks or so, but she wasn't sure she would have suggested it if she'd known it would be white. And she didn't know if she would ever get used to his new hair, which had been entirely his own idea. As long as she'd known him, his straight brown hair had been heavily streaked with gray, and she always found that attractive. But some months ago, he had decided to let it grow because he didn't want to be the only man in the State House with a 1950s haircut. And now, in luxuriance, it was far more gray than brown. It was long enough in back to hide the collars of his shirt and his coat, long and heavy enough on the sides to cover his ears and to swing against his cheeks when he leaned forward, and it hung cropped in carefully irregular bangs across his forehead in the manner of the actress Jane Fonda. That wasn't all. His legs, which she would have described as lean only a few years ago, looked so thin now in their neat gray flannel trousers as to suggest that he wouldn't be able to ride a bicycle without wobbling and veering slowly all over the street. And there are times, he was saying, delicately rubbing his closed eyelids with thumb and forefinger, there are times when I wish Frank Brady would just go away and get lost. You can't imagine what the pressure's like in that sweatshop. Well, get you a drink? Sure, she said, thanks. And she watched him walk out of the room to the kitchen. She heard the soft slam of the big refrigerator door and the breaking open of an ice tray. And then came something unexpected and frightening. A burst of high, wild laughter that didn't sound like David at all. It went on, rising into falsetto and falling only part of the way down as he gasped for breath. And he was still in the grip of its convulsions when he came weakly back into the room with a very dark bourbon and water rocking and clinking in his hand. Baby, listen, he said as soon as he was able to speak. I've just thought of the perfect revenge to take on Frank Brady. Listen. Staple. But he got no further than that before the laughter hit him again. When he recovered, he took a deep breath, made a sober face, and said, staple his lower lip to his desk. She achieved a smile, but it wasn't enough to please him. Oh, shit, he said, looking hurt. You don't think that's funny? Sure I do. It's pretty funny when you picture it. Then they were sitting close together on the sofa, and he was taking greedy swigs of his drink as if this rich, good whiskey was the main thing he had waited for all day. Could I have one too? She asked. Have one what? You know, a drink. Oh, Jesus, I'm sorry, he said as he got up to lunge for the kitchen again. I'm sorry, dear. I meant to fix you one, and I just forgot, that's all. I'm getting absent-minded in my old age, that's all. And she waited, still smiling, hoping he wouldn't want to talk about his old age anymore. He wasn't yet 47. Another time, late one night when they were alone and cleaning up after having several people in for dinner, David remarked sourly of one guest that he was a pompous, humorless young twerp. Oh, I wouldn't say that, Susan said. I think he's nice. Oh yeah, nice. That word covers just about everything for you. Doesn't it? Well, fuck it. Fuck nice. And he slammed out of the room and down the hall as if he meant to go straight to bed. There was a good deal of thumping and banging in the bedroom for a minute or two, then he came back and faced her again, trembling. Nice, he said. Nice. Is that what you want? You want the world to be nice? Because listen, baby. Listen, sweetheart. The world is about as nice as shit. The world is struggle and rape and humiliation and death. The world is no fucking place for a dreamy little rich girl from St. Louis. Do you understand me? Go home, for Christ's sake. Get out of here and go home to your fucking father if you want to find nice. While he stood shouting at her with all that gray and white hair shaking around his almost eclipsed, almost forgotten face, it was like watching a child's tantrum enacted in the person of a crazy old man. But it didn't last long. It was over quickly when he sat down in shame and silence to hold his elaborate head in his hands. Then soon enough came his choked out, abject apology. Oh, Jesus, Susan, I'm sorry, he said. I don't know what gets into me when I'm like that. It's all right, she told him. Let's just sort of go easy on each other for a while. And going easy on each other turned out to be almost a pleasure. The gentleness and quiet of it, the temperance of it, permitted them both to shy away from the heat of each other's concerns without ever seeming to flinch. Yet it permitted them the old intimacy too when they both felt like it, and so they got along. Through the difficulties of 2 more years, there were times of peace, times of exultant companionship, and other times of exasperation and bickering, or of silence. It all seemed to settle out into what David called a good marriage. Hey, Susan, he would ask now and then, affecting a boyish bashfulness. Think we'll make it? Sure, she would say. Not long after his nation's withdrawal from the war that had impelled him to change his life, David Clark made arrangements to go back to his teaching job. He then wrote a letter of resignation to Governor Brady, an act that made him feel wonderful, and he urged his wife not to worry about the future. away from the classroom, he explained, had simply been a mistake. Not a bad or a costly mistake, perhaps even one he could ultimately find profit in, but a mistake nonetheless. He was a schoolman. He had always been a schoolman and would probably always be. Unless, he said, looking suddenly shy, unless you think all of this is a kind of going backwards or something. Why would I think that? I don't know. Sometimes it's hard to tell what you're thinking. It always has been. Well, she said, I suppose that's something I can't help, isn't it? And they both fell silent. It was a warm afternoon at the end of summer. They were sitting with iced tea glasses in which ice had melted and the watery tea was almost gone. Oh, baby, listen, he began, and he reached over to clasp her thigh for emphasis, but hesitated and drew his hand back. Listen, he said again. Let me tell you something. We'll be all right. After a long pause, examining her warm glass, she said, No, we won't. Huh? I said, No, we won't. We haven't been all right for a long time, and we aren't all right now, and it isn't going to get any better. I'm sorry if this comes as a surprise, but it really shouldn't, and it wouldn't if you'd ever known me as well as you think you do. It's over. That's all. I'm leaving. I'll be taking Candace to California as soon as I can get our stuff packed, probably in a day or two. I'll call my parents tonight and tell them, and then my whole family will know. Once everybody knows, I imagine it'll be easier for you to accept. All the blood seemed to have gone out of David's face and all the moisture out of his mouth. I don't believe this, he said. I don't believe I'm sitting in this chair. Well, you'll believe it soon enough, and nothing you can say is going to stop me. He set his empty glass on the floor and got quickly to his feet, as he always did for shouting, but he didn't shout. Instead, he peered very closely at her face as if trying to penetrate the surface of it, and said, My God, you really mean this, don't you? I've really lost you, haven't I? You don't love me anymore. That's right, she said. Exactly. I don't love you anymore. Well, but for Christ's sake, Susan, why? Can you tell me why? There is no why, she said. There's no more why to not loving than there is to loving. Isn't that something most intelligent people understand? In an excellent residential suburb of St. Louis, a place of broad lawns and of deep, cool houses set back among shade trees, Edward Andrews sat alone in his study, trying to finish an article he'd been asked to write for a medical journal. He thought he had most of it right, but he couldn't find a way to work up the final paragraphs into a real conclusion, and every time he tried something different, it seemed to get worse. The thing kept coming to a stop rather than to an end. Ed? His wife called from the hallway. That was Susan on the phone. She's on the interstate and she'll be here with Candace in half an hour. You want to get dressed or anything? He certainly did. He wanted to take a quick hot shower too and to stand at the mirror solemnly combing and recombing his hair until he got it parted just the right way. A clean shirt then, with the cuffs folded back 2 turns and a fresh pair of lightweight flannels. All this to prove that at 63 he could still be spruce and vigorous for Susan. When she arrived, there were huggings and kissings in the front hall. Dr. Andrews' lips brushed the cool lobe of an ear, and there were happy exclamations at how much Candace had grown, how different she looked since the last time her grandparents had seen her. Alone in the kitchen, preparing drinks and coming to an abrupt, nervous decision that he'd better have a quick one now here before taking the tray into the living room. Dr. Andrews wondered once again what it was that could make him tremble in the presence of this dearest child, this particular girl. She was always so calm and so competent, for one thing. She had probably never done an incompetent or irresponsible thing in her life except for wasting her Turnbull College tuition that time. And that, now that he thought of it, was nothing at all compared to the way the millions of other children had behaved in those years, with their flowers and their love beads and their fuzzy-headed Eastern religions and their mindless pursuit of drug-induced derangement. Maybe David Clark could be thanked after all for having steered her away from all that. But no, that wasn't right. The credit couldn't go to Clark because it belonged to Susan herself. She was too intelligent ever to have been a vagabond, just as she was too honest to go on living with a man she no longer loved. So what are your plans, Susan? He asked as he brought the bright, tinkling tray of drinks into the room. California is kind of a big place, kind of a scary place, too. Scary? How do you mean? Oh, well, I don't know, he said, and he was ready to back down on anything now if it meant avoiding an argument. All I meant was, judging from some of the stuff you read in magazines and so forth, I don't really have any firsthand information at all. Susan explained then that she had a few friends in Marin County. That's up north of San Francisco, so she wouldn't be starting out among strangers. She would find a place to live and then she'd look for some kind of work. What kind? He asked. I mean, is there anything in particular you'd like to do? I don't really know yet, she said. I'm pretty good with children. I might work in a nursery school or a daycare center. Otherwise, I'll look for something else. She crossed her narrow, pretty knees under the hem of an attractive tweed skirt, and he wondered if she had changed into fresh clothes in some motel room on the road in order to look nice for this homecoming. Well, dear, he said, I hope you know I'll be happy to help out in any way I can if you're. No, no, Daddy, that's okay. We can get along easily on what David sends us. We'll be all right. And it was such a fine thing to hear her say Daddy that he allowed himself to sit back and almost relaxed. He didn't even ask the one question foremost in his mind. How is David, Susan? How's he taking all this? He had met and talked with David Clark only a few times, first at the wedding, and on 4 or 5 occasions since then, and he'd been surprised each time to discover that he liked the man. Once, tentatively, they had begun to discuss politics until David said, well, Doctor, I guess I've always been a bleeding heart liberal, and Edward Anders found that appealing. The humor and the self-deprecation of it, if not the way it might apply to current issues. He had even decided not to mind David's being 20 years older than Susan, or his having another earlier family far away, because all that seemed to suggest he wasn't likely to make any more mistakes. He would devote the prime of his middle age to his second marriage. And the best part, the thing seemed to make nothing else matter, was that this shy, courteous, sometimes bewildered-looking stranger could never take his eyes away from Susan in any gathering. Couldn't everybody see he was in love with her? And wasn't that the first thing to look for in a son-in-law? Well, sure it was. Of course it was. And so therefore, what now? What was the poor son of a bitch going to do with the rest of his life? Susan and her mother were talking of family matters. All 3 of the younger girls were living away from home now. 2 of them married, and there were other bits of news to be exchanged about the older girls. Then, after a while, inevitably, it seemed, they took up the subject of childbearing. Agnes Anders would be 60 before very long, and for many years she had been obliged to wear spectacles with lenses so thick that it wasn't easy to see the expression in her eyes. You had to rely on the smile or the frown or the patient neutral look of her mouth. And her husband had to acknowledge that the rest of her was rapidly aging too. There wasn't much left of her once lustrous hair except what the hairdresser could salvage and primp. Her body sagged in some places and was bloated in others. She looked like what she was, a woman who had been called mother in shrill, hungering voices for most of her life. Long ago, almost beyond memory, she had been a neat, crisp, surprisingly passionate young nurse, whose flesh he had been wholly unable to resist. The only minor deterrent easily ignored from their first night, right on up through the night he'd proposed to her. I love you, Agnes. Oh, I love you, and I need you. I need you. The only qualifying aspect of his love had been his knowledge that some people, his mother for one, might think it strange of him to marry a girl of the working class. Well, Judy was my easiest, she was saying. I never knew a thing. I went into the hospital and they put me under, and when I woke up it was all over. She was born. I was full of painkillers, so I felt all right, and somebody gave me a bowl of Rice Krispies. No, but some of the others were a lot harder. You, for instance. Yours was a difficult birth. Still, I think my worst times were with the younger girls, probably because I was getting older. Agnes rarely talked at such length. Whole days could pass without her saying a word, but this had come to be her favorite topic. She sat leaning forward, her forearms on her knees, and her clasped hands rolling this way and that to emphasize the point she was making. And you see, Dr. Palmer thought I was unconscious. They all did, but the anesthetic wasn't working. I could feel everything, and I could hear every word they said. I heard Dr. Palmer say, watch out for that uterus, it's thin as paper. God, Susan said, weren't you frightened? And Agnes gave a tired little laugh that made her glasses gleam in the fading afternoon light. Well, she said, when you've been through it as many times as I have, I guess you don't really think much about being frightened anymore. Candace, who had been given a glass of ginger ale with a cherry in it, went over to stand and stare out the big windows that faced west, almost as if she were trying to gauge the distance to California. Mommy, she called, turning back, are we staying here tonight or what? Oh, no, honey, Susan told her. We can only stay a little while. We've got a long drive ahead. Out in the kitchen again, Edward Andrews broke open a tray of ice cubes with more force and noise than necessary, hoping it might stifle his mounting rage. But it didn't. He had to turn away and press his forehead hard against the heel of one trembling hand like a goddamned actor in a tragedy. Girls. Would they always drive you crazy? Would their smiles of rejection always drop you into despair, and their smiles of welcome lead only into new, worse, more terrible ways of breaking your heart? Were you expected to listen forever to one of them bragging about how paper thin her womb was, or to another saying, we can only stay a little while? Oh, dear Christ. How in the whole of a lifetime can anybody understand girls? After a minute or two, he achieved a semblance of composure. He carried the fresh strings back into the living room with an almost stately bearing, determined that for this next last little while he would keep everything down and quiet inside him, so that neither of these girls, these women, would sense his anguish. Half an hour later, in the early dusk, they were all out of the driveway. Candace was seated and belted in on the passenger side of the car, and Susan, with the car keys out and ready in her hand, was embracing her mother. Then she stepped over to give her father a hug, but it wasn't really much of a hug at all. It was more like an agreeable gesture of dismissal. Drive carefully, dear, he said into the softness of her dark, fragrant hair. And listen. She drew away from him with a pleasant, attentive look, but he had swallowed whatever it was or might have been that he wanted her to know. And all he said instead was, listen, keep in touch, okay?